Imagine waking up on the cold kitchen floor, blood dripping from your nose, and knowing with certainty that the person who did this was the one you loved most in the world. This is the true story of Margaret Thompson, a 63-year-old woman who turned 3 years of terror into a masterful act of revenge. Margaret woke at 5:30 a.m. on the cold ceramic tiles. Her mouth was swollen, her wrists bruised by violent hands. All because dinner hadn't been seasoned the way he wanted. Her son Derek, 37, an executive at a construction firm, had beaten her brutally the night before. But that beating was just one more in a long chain of torture. For 3 years, Derek had turned Margaret's quiet retirement into a private concentration camp. He controlled every dollar of her pension, forced her to work as a servant in her own home, and exploded in violence over the smallest things. Derek came down for breakfast in his impeccable navy suit, furiously typing on his iPhone. "Where's my coffee? I have an investor presentation today," he shouted, not even noticing his mother's bruised face. For him, beating his own mother was routine. Margaret prepared everything with obsessive precision. Eggs, Benedict with Canadian ham, whole-grain toast, pure Colombian coffee. Every detail had to be perfect. 1 degree off in the coffee's temperature, a pinch too much salt in the eggs, and Derek would erupt in uncontrollable fury. Victoria, Derek's second wife, entered wearing a beige Chanel blazer and red Louboutin heels. At 26, she treated Margaret as if she were invisible furniture. "Morning, Mrs. Thompson," she said with the affected accent she used to impress others. "Did you sleep well?" Margaret wanted to scream that she had slept on the kitchen floor cleaning up her own blood, but instead she murmured, "Yes, dear." Derek picked up an imported foundation from the table. "Mom, I bought this Lancome base for you. It perfectly covers those little marks from when you tripped on the stairs yesterday." Little marks. That's what he called the bruises his fists had made. With trembling hands, Margaret applied the expensive makeup, covering every trace of violence. How many mornings had she done this? How many times had she invented household accidents to hide the terrible truth? What Margaret didn't know was that her neighbor Grace, a 59-year-old retired nurse, had quietly installed a security camera pointed at her kitchen window. Grace had suspected for months that something was terribly wrong in that picture-perfect house. While Victoria touched up her lipstick, Derek whispered in his mother's ear, "Remember what we talked about yesterday? If you open your mouth, if you tell anyone what happens here, you'll regret it. Nobody will believe a crazy old woman living off her son's charity." A cold shiver ran down Margaret's spine. The couple left hand in hand, the picture of perfection they pretended to be. Margaret watched them get into Derek's black BMW X7, bought with her retirement savings. When silence finally filled the house, she collapsed onto a kitchen chair and cried tears of pure rage. At that moment, she couldn't imagine that within weeks her life would change completely, that she would uncover devastating secrets about Derek, and that she would orchestrate a revenge so perfect he would lose everything: freedom, money, reputation, and his wife. Margaret spent the morning obsessively cleaning the house, trying to erase any imperfect trace that might trigger another of Derek's explosions. That was how it worked. She lived in constant tension, anticipating every possible spark of his rage. At 11 a.m., the phone rang, an unknown number. "Mrs. Thompson, this is James Patterson, Chief Accountant at Morrison & Associates Construction. I urgently need to speak with you regarding some financial irregularities involving your son Derek. Could you come to the office at 2 p.m. me?" Margaret's heart raced. Financial irregularities. Derek always said he was an exemplary executive, that he earned his money purely on merit. "What kind of irregularities, Mr. Patterson?" "I'd rather not discuss it over the phone, Mrs. Thompson. It's very serious. Please, come alone." Margaret hung up with trembling hands. A strange feeling washed over her, half fear, half hope. Could it be that Derek had made a mistake that might finally free her from this nightmare? At 1:30 p.m., Margaret slipped quietly out of the house toward downtown. She hadn't felt the fresh air of the street without Derek's oppressive supervision in months. For a few minutes, she almost forgot the constant terror of her life. The Morrison & Associates office occupied the 15th floor of a glass and steel skyscraper. James Patterson, 48, looked serious and professional. When he saw Margaret enter, he immediately noticed the makeup traces covering bruises on her neck. "Mrs. Thompson," James began, opening a folder full of documents. "We've discovered that your son Derek has been diverting company funds into personal accounts for the past 8 months. We're talking about approximately $75,000 in fraudulent transfers." Margaret felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. "That can't be right. Derek is an exemplary employee." James showed her a series of bank records. "The money leaves company accounts and goes straight into a joint account he holds with you. Then it's withdrawn or moved into other accounts under his control." She studied the documents in growing horror. There was her name, her forged signature, authorizing transfers she had never even heard of. Derek not only beat her physically, he had turned her into an unwilling accomplice to his crimes. "Mrs. Thompson," James continued gently, "we believe you're the victim of financial fraud, not a willing participant. But we need your cooperation to prosecute Derek and recover the stolen funds." "What will happen to him?" Margaret asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "With the evidence we have, Derek faces charges of embezzlement, document forgery, and bank fraud. He's looking at 8 to 12 years in prison." Margaret sat in silence for long minutes. 8 to 12 years. Derek could be locked away for nearly a decade. She would be free. "There's more," James added. "During our investigation, we also discovered that Derek has been selling confidential company information to competitors. That adds corporate espionage to the charges." Margaret left the office with a mix of emotions she hadn't felt in years: relief, hope, and for the first time in decades, a real sense of power. Derek had committed serious crimes, and she now held the evidence to destroy him completely. But when she got home at 5 p.m., Derek was already waiting, wearing the expression she knew all too well, the look that always came before violence. "Where were you?" he asked in a dangerously calm voice. For the first time in 3 years, Margaret met his gaze without lowering her eyes. "I was at your office, Derek." Derek's expression changed instantly. For a fraction of a second, Margaret saw something she had never seen in her son's eyes before: genuine fear. The mask of total control cracked, revealing panic underneath. "What the hell are you talking about?" Derek asked, but his voice no longer sounded confident. $75,000, Derek. I spoke with James Patterson. I know everything about the money you stole from the company using my bank account." Derek moved closer, like a predator calculating the perfect moment to strike. But this time, something was different. Margaret did not back down. After decades of being a victim, she had found a weapon: the truth. "Listen carefully, you senile old woman," Derek hissed through clenched teeth. "You have no idea what you're talking about. That money is mine by right. You owe me every cent I've spent keeping this house, feeding you, paying your medical bills." "With my money," Margaret shot back, feeling a courage she never knew she had. "My retirement, my savings from 40 years at the law firm." Derek grabbed her arm hard enough to leave marks. "You're not going anywhere. You won't talk to anyone. And if you ever betray me again—" "Let me go!" Margaret screamed with all the strength in her lungs. Derek was so shocked by her outburst that he actually let go. For 3 years, she had been his silent victim. Now, for the first time, she was shouting back. At that moment, the doorbell rang. It was Grace, the neighbor, holding a tray of lasagna, her face full of concern. "Margaret, dear, are you all right? I heard shouting and got worried." Derek instantly switched to his public persona: fake smile, elegant posture, cordial voice. "Hello, Grace. My mother was just a little upset because she burned dinner. You know how older people get nervous about those things." But Grace was not easily fooled. Her nurse's eyes immediately noticed the fresh bruises on Margaret's arm, her defensive posture, the fear she could barely hide. "Of course," Grace said calmly. "Margaret, here's the lasagna I promised. And remember, if you need anything at all, I'm right next door." Her words carried a clear subtext that Margaret understood instantly. "I know what's happening, and I'm here to help." After Grace left, Derek slammed the door unnecessarily hard. "Meddling old women," he muttered. "But this isn't over, dear mother. Tomorrow we're going to the bank together, and you'll sign every paper I put in front of you. You'll withdraw any complaint you've made and say it was all just a big misunderstanding." "No," Margaret said simply. "What did you say?" "I said no. I won't sign anything. I won't withdraw any complaint. And I will no longer be complicit in your crimes." Derek stared at her with a rage she had never seen before. It was as if he had finally stripped away all masks, revealing the monster that had always lurked beneath the facade of a respectful son. "Fine," he said with a calmness more terrifying than his screams. "If that's how you want to play, we'll play. But I warn you, when I'm finished with you, you'll wish you had never been born." Margaret didn't sleep a minute that night. Derek stayed locked in his room, talking on the phone for hours. She didn't know what he was planning, but she knew she had to be ready for the worst. At 3 a.m, she heard a strange noise in the yard. Peering out the window, she saw a figure moving among the bushes. It was Grace, and she seemed to be installing something near the kitchen window. The next day, Margaret discovered what it was. A small security camera hidden among the plants, pointed directly at her house. Her neighbor wasn't just suspicious, she was documenting everything. The next morning, Derek woke even earlier than usual, at 4:30 a.m. Margaret heard him moving around the house, speaking in a low voice on the phone, preparing something that put her on high alert. When she came down to the kitchen, he was impeccably dressed in his best black Armani suit, hair perfectly combed, wearing the red tie he reserved for his most important meetings. He looked like the successful executive everyone thought he was, not the monster she knew intimately. "Good morning, Mother," he said with a sweetness that made Margaret's skin crawl. "I hope you slept well." That false gentleness was more terrifying than his rage. Margaret had known Derek for 37 years. When he acted like this, he was planning something terrible. "I've been thinking about our conversation all night," he continued, sitting at the table. "And you're right. Maybe I've been too hard on you. After all, you're my mother and you deserve respect." Margaret served breakfast in silence, every nerve in her body tense. Derek admitting he was wrong, apologizing. It was so out of character that she knew with absolute certainty it was a trap. "That's why," Derek continued, spreading butter on his toast, "today we're going to the bank together to clear up this misunderstanding with my company. You'll explain that you authorized all the transfers, that you knew exactly what was happening with your money." "I won't do that, Derek." The fake smile slowly disappeared from his face. "Of course you will, Mother. Because if you don't, some very unpleasant things will happen." "Are you threatening me?" "I'm not threatening," Derek said, finishing his coffee. "I'm explaining reality. Look around you. This house, this table where you eat breakfast, the bed you sleep in, the food you eat, all of this exists because I allow it." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine, but forced herself to keep her voice steady. "With my money." "Also," Derek smiled coldly, "I've been thinking of calling some doctors. I know specialists in elderly patients with mental issues, senile dementia, you know. It's very sad when mothers start making up stories, accusing their own sons of terrible things." Margaret's blood froze. He wasn't just threatening to throw her out of the house. He was threatening to have her declared mentally incompetent so no one would believe her testimony. "There are plenty of witnesses who can confirm your deteriorating mental state," Derek continued, voice calculated. "Victoria, for example. I told her yesterday how confused you've been lately. And those friends who came for lunch noticed something strange, too. It was all lies, but he was so convincing that for a moment, Margaret doubted her own sanity. That was how his manipulation worked, making her question her very perception of reality. At that moment, the doorbell rang. It was Grace, but this time, she wasn't alone. With her stood a well-dressed woman in her mid-40s, carrying a leather briefcase. "Margaret," Grace said, "this is Sandra Williams, a public prosecutor specializing in domestic violence and financial fraud. She needs to speak with you urgently." Derek immediately switched to his charming mode. "Ladies, my mother has been a little confused lately. Perhaps this isn't the best time." "Actually," Sandra interrupted with authority, "this is exactly the right time. Mrs. Thompson, your neighbor came to me with some very interesting evidence about your situation." Grace pulled a tablet from her bag. "Margaret, I showed Sandra the recordings I made of your conversation with Derek yesterday. The threats, the blackmail, the coercion, we have everything documented." Derek visibly paled. "What recordings? This is an invasion of privacy. It's inadmissible in court." "Actually," Sandra smiled, "recordings made from public property to document a possible domestic crime are perfectly legal. And what we heard, combined with the financial fraud evidence, gives us grounds for immediate action." For the first time in years, Margaret felt a spark of real hope. She was no longer alone. She had allies, evidence, a genuine chance to escape. "Mrs. Thompson," Sandra continued, "I need you to come with me now to give a formal statement. With the evidence we have, we can arrest Derek today." Derek jumped up from the table. "This is ridiculous. I'm a respected citizen, a company director. I won't allow—" "Derek Thompson," Sandra said firmly, "you have the right to remain silent." Derek tried to keep his composure, but Margaret could see panic rising in his eyes. For 3 years, he had controlled every aspect of her life through fear and manipulation. Now, for the first time, he was the one who was afraid. "You're making a terrible mistake," Derek said, trying to sound authoritative. "I'm a director at Morrison & Associates Construction. I have lawyers, important connections. My mother has mental problems. She makes things up." Sandra cut in coldly. "Mr. Thompson, we've already spoken with James Patterson at your company. We know about the $75,000 diverted, the confidential information sold to competitors, and the fraudulent bank accounts. None of this has anything to do with your mother's mental health. And we have this," Grace added, showing the tablet. "Derek threatening his own mother, admitting total financial control over her, promising to make her look crazy if she didn't obey." Margaret heard her own voice from the device. "Let me go." And then Derek's icy reply, "If you ever betray me again." It was all there, recorded and indisputable. Derek ran a hand through his hair, messing up the perfect style for the first time Margaret could remember. His successful executive facade was collapsing fast. "Mom," he said, turning to Margaret with that lost little boy voice he used to manipulate her, "please don't let them do this to me. I love you. You know I love you. You are the most important thing in my life." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. How many times had she fallen for that emotional blackmail? How many times had she forgiven the abuse because he cried and begged afterward? "Derek," she said calmly, "if I were truly important to you, you would never have laid a hand on me." At that moment, 2 officers came in through the front door. Grace had left it unlocked. Sandra had called for backup while speaking with Derek. "Derek Thompson," the taller officer said, "you are under arrest for embezzlement, bank fraud, domestic violence, and witness intimidation. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can be used against you in court. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one, one will be appointed." "This is absurd," Derek shouted as he was handcuffed. "You don't know who you're dealing with. I have lawyers. I have connections. I'll sue all of you." But his threats now sounded hollow. Without Margaret's fear to prop them up, They were just the words of a desperate criminal being brought to justice. As Derek was led out of the house, Margaret felt as if a ton of weight had lifted from her shoulders. For the first time in 3 years, she could breathe freely in her own home. "Mrs. Thompson," Sandra said, "we need you to come with us to formalize the complaint. With the evidence we have, Derek likely won't get bail." In the car on the way to the station, Grace held Margaret's hand. "How are you feeling?" "Free," Margaret replied, surprised to realize she was crying, not from sadness, but from pure relief. At the station, Margaret gave a detailed statement about 3 years of abuse. Every slap, every humiliation, every threat. Sandra recorded everything, creating an official record of the terror her life had been. "There's something else you should know," Sandra said after the deposition. "Derek's company wants to settle. They discovered the thefts didn't start 8 months ago. They started 2 years ago." Margaret felt nauseous. 2 years. In total, he embezzled $130,000. Since you were the victim of fraud, not a willing accomplice, they want to compensate you. $50,000 plus a financial consultant job at $4,000 a month. $50,000 in compensation and $4,000 a month. Margaret hadn't seen that much money in years. More than that, it was official recognition that she had been a victim, not a criminal. "And Derek?" she asked. "With all the evidence, the fraud, the recordings, your testimony, he's looking at 8 to 12 years in prison, and given his threats, bail is off the table." Margaret closed her eyes and for the first time in 3 years, smiled genuinely. 3 days after Derek's arrest, Margaret was getting used to the strange sensation of peace in her own home. She no longer needed to tiptoe or weigh every word before speaking. That tranquility, however, was interrupted by an urgent knock at the door. It was Victoria, utterly changed. No makeup, disheveled hair, wrinkled clothes. Her eyes were red from crying, a stark contrast to the always polished woman Margaret knew. "Mrs. Thompson," Victoria said, her voice trembling, "I need to talk to you. It's about Derek. There are things you need to know." Margaret let her in, curious but cautious. For 2 years, Victoria had treated Margaret like invisible furniture. What could have changed? "First," Victoria began, sitting on the edge of the sofa, "I want to apologize. I knew something was wrong in this house. I heard the shouting, saw your bruises, noticed how you shrank every time Derek raised his voice." "Then why didn't you ever say anything?" Victoria began to cry. "Because I was afraid. Derek, he threatened me too. He said if I betrayed him, he'd destroy my career and reputation. I was a coward. I let you suffer alone because I was afraid of losing my comfortable life." Margaret felt a mixture of anger and pity. "What do you want now?" "When they arrested Derek, I went to his home office to collect some legal documents. Margaret, what I found there." Victoria opened a folder thick with papers. "Derek wasn't just stealing from the company. He was stealing from me too." Margaret examined the documents, statements showing unauthorized transfers from Victoria's personal account, forged life insurance policies, even a second mortgage on the house Victoria thought was paid off. "Over our 2 years of marriage," Victoria continued, "Derek stole more than $80,000 from my family inheritance, money my grandmother left me, which I believed was invested and growing." "My God," Margaret murmured, "but there's more, much more." Victoria produced another set of papers. "Derek has a third bank account neither I nor the company knew about, an account in the Cayman Islands with over $200,000. Margaret felt the floor vanish beneath her. $200,000 offshore? Derek wasn't just a domestic abuser and common thief. He was a sophisticated financial criminal. "How did you find this?" "I found bank correspondence hidden in his safe. Derek was planning to flee the country. Margaret, if the fraud charges had taken a few weeks longer, he would have disappeared with all the money." Victoria showed forged passports, airline tickets to non-extradition countries, even a fully fabricated new identity. Derek had been planning his escape for months. "There's one more thing," Victoria said, hesitating. "Derek, he's done this before. I found records of 2 other older women he took care of over the last 10 years, an aunt in Seattle and an elderly neighbor in Portland. Both died under suspicious circumstances after changing their wills to benefit him." Margaret's blood ran cold. Derek wasn't just an abuser. He was potentially a serial killer who targeted vulnerable elderly women. "Victoria, did you take this to the police?" "I came to you first. I thought you deserved to know the truth about the man who almost killed you. But yes, I'm taking all of this to Sandra Williams this afternoon." Margaret stood and began pacing, trying to process the magnitude of Derek's crimes. It wasn't just about slaps, shouting, and stolen money. Derek was a calculating predator who might have eventually killed her. "Why are you doing this now?" Margaret asked. "Why help me after 2 years of pretending I didn't exist?" Victoria wiped her tears. "Because I found my private diary in his office, a diary I keep locked in my nightstand. Derek was reading everything, mapping my weaknesses and insecurities, planning how to manipulate me better." She took a deep breath. "And because I found this." Victoria showed a document that made Margaret go pale. A draft will with Margaret's forged signature, leaving everything to Derek. "He was planning your death, Mrs. Thompson. If I hadn't found this evidence, if I hadn't found the courage to speak, you could have been next." Margaret sank heavily into the armchair. Derek wasn't just her abusive son. He was a serial predator who saw her as his final target. Now, however, she had the evidence to ensure he would never hurt anyone again. 2 hours after Victoria's call, Sandra Williams arrived at Margaret's house with a small team: forensic investigators and an FBI special agent in international financial crimes. What had begun as a domestic violence case was now turning into a federal criminal investigation. "Mrs. Thompson," Sandra said, reviewing the documents Victoria had brought. "This completely changes the scope. Derek isn't just a domestic abuser. He's an international financial criminal with a possible homicide history." The financial crimes specialist, FBI Special Agent Robert Chen, examined the offshore statements. "This pattern is consistent with professional money laundering. Derek wasn't merely stealing. He built a system to conceal the proceeds." Victoria showed the correspondence she'd found. There are letters from Swiss banks, communications with law firms in non-extradition countries, even contracts to purchase property in Brazil. Derek was building a parallel life, Chen explained. False identity, forged documents, international accounts. This level of sophistication suggests years, possibly decades, of planning. Sandra turned to Margaret. "I need to ask some difficult questions. Do you recall Derek showing unusual interest in your personal finances, wills, life insurance, beneficiaries?" Margaret considered carefully. "About a year ago, he insisted I take out a new life insurance policy, naming him as the primary beneficiary, saying it was just in case. He also wanted to review my will and offered to take my papers to the notary to speed things up." Sandra noted it down. "That supports a preparation theory. Combined with Victoria's findings and the financial trail, we have grounds to broaden the charges: fraud, laundering, attempted homicide, and to seek interstate cooperation on the 2 suspicious deaths." Chen nodded. "I'll coordinate with our Seattle and Portland offices to reopen those cases with the local DA's support. If toxicology matches the substances seized, we proceed to murder charges." Margaret drew a steadying breath. For the first time, she saw the monster in full, and also a competent net closing in. 3 days later, at the bail hearing, the courtroom was packed. Local headlines already read, "Executive arrested for attempting to kill his own mother." Derek entered in handcuffs and an orange jumpsuit. The polished, controlled man was gone, hair disheveled, deep circles under his eyes, the look of a cornered animal. He spotted Margaret in the gallery and tried that lost little boy expression that once worked. But this time she held his gaze, unafraid. Judge Harrison opened the file, now over 500 pages of evidence. "Mr. Thompson," he began, "the charges against you include $130,000 in embezzlement, international bank fraud, aggravated domestic violence, premeditated attempted murder, and 2 potential counts of first-degree murder." Derek's defense attorney, a young, inexperienced hire, the best he could afford, attempted, "Your Honor, my client is a respected member of the business community." "Your client," the judge cut in, "systematically planned to murder his own mother after stealing her life savings. The state has presented evidence of illegally acquired poisons, fraudulent insurance policies, and a pattern of similar behavior involving 2 other victims." Sandra rose. "Your Honor, we've just received confirmation from Seattle. Eleanor Patterson did not die from an accidental fall. Exhumation revealed lethal levels of digitalis, the same substance found in Derek's apartment." Derek blanched. Suspicion had become physical proof. "In addition," Sandra continued, "we found over $300,000 in offshore accounts Derek controlled under false identities, money stolen not only from his mother and wife, but from the other victims as well." Judge Harrison shook his head gravely. "Mr. Thompson, given the extreme seriousness of the charges and the clear danger you pose to the community, and particularly to your mother, bail is denied. You will remain in custody pending trial." Derek exploded. "This is injustice. She's lying. She's a crazy old woman who made it all up for money." His shouts echoed, confirming the violent behavior Margaret had described. Guards restrained him as he continued to threaten. "You'll pay for this, Mother. When I get out of here." The judge struck the gavel. "Mr. Thompson, your in-court threats will be added to the charges. Officers, remove him." Margaret exhaled, sensing, more clearly than ever, that freedom was finally on her. 2 weeks after Derek's arrest, Margaret was settling into her new routine. She now worked as a financial consultant at Morrison & Associates, ironically, the very company Derek had stolen from. Her colleagues treated her with genuine respect, something she hadn't experienced in years. But Derek hadn't given up. From prison, he orchestrated one last desperate attempt at control and revenge. It began with a letter delivered through his lawyer, not an ordinary letter, but a carefully crafted psychological bomb. "Dear Mother, I hope you're enjoying your little victory. I hope you feel very brave for betraying me. But know this, it isn't over." The old fear threatened to resurface, but Margaret forced herself to keep reading. "I know secrets about you that no one else does. Secrets you kept for 40 years at the law firm. Things that could ruin not just your reputation, but your freedom." Margaret's heart froze. What secrets? For 4 decades as secretary at Wilson & Associates, she had handled confidential matters, but never believed she had done anything illegal. "Remember the Williams v. Cahom state case, 15 years ago? I found the documents you hid, the ones you altered to help Mr. Wilson win that multi-million-dollar case." Her hands shook. She vaguely recalled the case. It involved a pharmaceutical company accused of concealing deadly side effects. Mr. Wilson had instructed her to reorganize files, but she had believed it was routine. "I have copies of everything. If you don't withdraw the charges and publicly apologize, these documents will end up in the prosecutor's hands." The letter laid out step by step how Derek would destroy her life. He boasted of media contacts and journalists eager to pay for a scandal about judicial corruption. Shaken, Margaret called Sandra Williams immediately. "This is clear blackmail," the prosecutor said after reading it, "but we need to know if his threats hold any real weight." "What do you remember about that Williams case?" Margaret recounted everything: file reorganizations, notary visits, her duties at the time. "Did you know it might be illegal?" Sandra asked. "No," Margaret replied honestly. "I did exactly what my boss said was standard procedure." The following days were a nightmare of legal uncertainty. Margaret lived in constant dread of arrest. Grace became her anchor. No matter what happens, her neighbor reassured her, we'll face it together. A week later, another letter arrived, this one even crueler. These photos will be in tomorrow's paper, Derek wrote, attaching images of old documents with Margaret's handwritten notes. But Sandra already had a plan to neutralize Derek once and for all. The next day, Sandra summoned Margaret for an urgent meeting. She wasn't alone. Beside her stood a well-dressed middle-aged man with a serious expression. "Margaret," Sandra said, "this is Richard Wilson, Jr., son of the attorney you worked for over 40 years. Margaret paled. If her old boss's son was there, her fears were legitimate. "Mrs. Thompson," Richard said kindly, "Sandra told me about Derek's threats regarding the Williams case 15 years ago. Mr. Wilson, I swear I didn't know what I was doing was illegal." "Your father told me," Richard raised a hand. "You did nothing illegal. My father was the responsible attorney. Any file reorganizations were done under proper legal supervision. You were simply following orders." Margaret exhaled in relief. "But the documents Derek has—" "They're irrelevant," Richard said. "We discovered how he obtained them. He broke into the firm's sealed archives 2 years ago. We have security footage of him copying confidential files," Sandra added. "So he committed yet another crime, trying to blackmail you, breaking and entering, theft of legal documents, blackmail. That adds another 5 to 7 years. And more," Richard continued. "Derek wasn't a model employee who went astray. He has a history of 12 years of petty theft, contract manipulation, and extortion of colleagues. He's been honing his craft long before targeting you." Margaret covered her mouth. 12 years? "Yes," Sandra confirmed. "You weren't the victim of a troubled son. You were the victim of a calculating predator." Richard opened his briefcase. "We have a proposal. Instead of reacting to Derek's blackmail, let's outmaneuver him. We'll hold a press conference where you voluntarily disclose any past mistakes. That way, you strip him of all ammunition." "It's risky," Richard admitted. "It means publicly acknowledging errors from 15 years ago. It could be humiliating." Margaret looked out the window at the empty house across the street, a reflection of her past mistakes and pain, but also a symbol of freedom and new beginnings. "Let's do it," she said. "I'm tired of living in fear, tired of Derek controlling my life from behind bars." Sandra smiled. "Tomorrow, he'll get the surprise of his life." That afternoon, as they prepared the press conference, Margaret received an unexpected visit. James Patterson from Morrison and Associates. "Mrs. Thompson, we'd like to offer you a position, $5,000 a month, full health benefits, and a $75,000 compensation package in recognition of the harm you inadvertently suffered." Margaret could hardly believe it. $5,000 a month, more than triple her pension. "There's one condition," James added. "We'll need you to testify at Derek's trial." "Of course," Margaret replied without hesitation. "I'll do whatever it takes." That night, for the first time in months, Margaret slept deeply in her own bed, knowing she was finally about to take full control of her narrative. The press conference was set for 2 p.m. in a room packed with journalists, cameras, and microphones. Margaret had never felt so exposed and vulnerable, yet she had never felt so powerful. As she sat before the cameras, she felt a different kind of fear, not the fear of Derek, of beatings or threats, but the fear of freedom, the fear of taking full responsibility for her own life. "My name is Margaret Thompson," she began, looking straight into the cameras. "I'm 63 years old, and for the past 3 years, I've been a victim of domestic violence at the hands of my son, Derek Thompson." She told her whole story: the assaults, the financial control, the threats, the systematic theft. And she also revealed the part Derek had counted on her keeping secret. "For 40 years I worked as a secretary at Wilson and Associates, and I made mistakes. At the time, I didn't know they were illegal, but I recognize them as such now. Margaret explained the Williams case, the reorganized files, the undeclared money. She hid nothing. My son discovered those mistakes and has been using them to blackmail me from prison. He threatened to expose me publicly unless I dropped the charges. The room fell completely silent. Journalists scribbled furiously. I'm here today to take that weapon away from him. I would rather face the consequences of my mistakes than remain a victim of his manipulation. She paused, her voice growing steadier. I want to send a message to all women being abused by sons, husbands, or partners. Emotional blackmail, financial control, threats of exposure, these are all forms of abuse. Don't let fear of public judgment keep you imprisoned. After the conference, Sandra told her that the DA's office had decided not to prosecute Margaret for her past mistakes. Your voluntary confession, combined with the fact that you were blackmailed, makes you far more valuable as a witness than as a defendant. That night, Margaret slept in her own house again. Grace insisted on staying the first few nights until she felt completely safe. Her phone rang at 9 p.m. Ma. It was a call from the prison, but this time she wasn't afraid to answer. Mom. Derek's voice came through, utterly defeated. I saw your press conference on the news. And what did you think? Margaret asked, surprised at her own calm. You ruined everything. You destroyed my last chance to get out of here. No, Derek. You destroyed that when you decided to make your mother your victim. A long silence followed. Will you ever forgive me? He finally asked. Margaret considered carefully. Someday, when you pay for what you've done, when you seek real help to change, when you understand the damage you caused, someday I might manage to forgive you. She paused, but I will never forget. Margaret ended the call. Tomorrow her new job, her new life, would begin. As she prepared to sleep in her own bed, in her own home, without fear of waking to screams or blows, Margaret reflected on the journey. Derek had learned that victims can become strong, that secrets lose their power in the light, and that justice, though slow, eventually arrives. And Margaret had learned that it is never too late to reclaim your life, no matter how many years you've spent in the shadows. 6 months later, Margaret sat in court for Derek's final trial. He had been found guilty on multiple counts: 2 first-degree murders, attempted murder, embezzlement, bank fraud, domestic violence, and blackmail. The man being sentenced looked nothing like the arrogant executive who had terrorized her. Derek was thin, pale, with gray hair that hadn't been there 6 months earlier. Prison had shattered his facade of absolute control. Derek Thompson, said Judge Harrison, you have been found guilty of the most heinous crimes I have seen in 30 years on the bench. You systematically hunted, manipulated, and murdered vulnerable elderly women for financial gain. Derek tried to speak, but the judge silenced him. You turned maternal love into a weapon of terror. You perverted family trust into a tool of extortion. You have shown no remorse, no empathy, no recognition of the devastating harm you caused. Margaret watched her son, her former son, receive 3 life sentences without the possibility of parole. She had expected sadness, but felt only profound relief. Victoria approached after the sentencing. In recent months, they had become unlikely allies, 2 women who had survived the same predator. How do you feel? Victoria asked. Free, Margaret replied. Completely free. Victoria had divorced Derek and recovered her stolen money in court. She decided to use part of the restored inheritance to start a foundation for women victimized by financial abuse within their families. Would you be our first official spokesperson? She asked. Margaret smiled. It would be an honor. In the months that followed, Margaret became a national advocate for seniors' rights. Her story, from silent victim to empowered woman, inspired thousands of others to seek help. Grace remained her best friend and neighbor. Every Friday, they had dinner together, sometimes talking about the past, but more often planning the future. "Do you have any regrets?" Grace asked one evening. Margaret considered. "I regret taking 3 years to act. I regret doubting my own worth for so long. But I don't regret fighting back." Her work at Morrison & Associates proved not only lucrative, but deeply fulfilling. Margaret discovered a natural talent for helping other victims of financial crimes rebuild their lives. Her house, completely renovated with the compensation money, became a personal symbol of renewal. Every room was redecorated, every reminder of the years of terror erased. A year after Derek's arrest, Margaret received his final call. His voice sounded different, broken, genuinely remorseful. "Mom," he said, "I'm in therapy. I finally understand what I did to you. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know I'm trying to become a different person." "I'm glad to hear that," Margaret replied honestly. "But, Derek, you need to understand. You are no longer my son. That relationship died the day you decided to use me as a punching bag." She paused. "But I hope you find peace in therapy. Not for me, for the other women you hurt." It was the last time they spoke. Margaret concluded her story, looking straight into the camera. If you're watching this and recognize your own situation, if someone in your family is controlling your finances, hitting you, making you question your sanity, know that you are not alone. Seek help. No matter your age, how long it's been going on, or how impossible escape may seem, you deserve to live without fear. I was 63 when I finally found the courage to fight. It is never too late to reclaim your life. She finished with the words that had become her motto. Derek learned that victims can become warriors, that secrets lose power in daylight, and that justice, though sometimes slow, always comes to those brave enough to fight for it. And I learned that at 63, I still had a whole life ahead of me, a life without fear, without manipulation, without violence, a life where I decide when to wake up, what to eat, and whom to speak to. Margaret rose from the chair where she had recorded her final statement, taking one last look at the camera. This was my story of liberation. I hope it inspires other women to break their own chains, no matter who put them there. She walked to the window of her renovated home, where Grace waited with a cup of tea and a warm smile. At 64, Margaret Thompson had finally found what she had searched for all her life: peace, safety, and control over her own destiny. Outside, the sun set over the small town, and for the first time in decades, Margaret was not afraid of what tomorrow might bring.